Two-time WWE Raw Women's Champion, four-time WWE SmackDown Women's Champion, the winner of the 2019 Women's Royal Rumble. Pro Wrestling Illustrated's Woman of the Year in 2018 and 2019, ranked number one of the top 100 female wrestlers in the PWI Women's 100 in 2019. Ladies, gentlemen, my non-binary friends, it is I, Josh Robinson, here for Love Wrestling, and this week we're going big time, because it's the legacy of the man, Becky Lynch. How have I not done an episode of this series on arguably one of the most impactful female wrestlers in the history of professional wrestling? When I was going to decide, what episodes I'm going to do and everything like that for Love Wrestling, I go through and I'm like, I've already done a legacy of Becky Lynch. It's not needed to be done anymore because I've already done it. Well, turns out the legacy of Becky Lynch was not something I had done. So here we are. We're well into this series and we're doing arguably what will be known to many as maybe the biggest episode that I could do within the female wrestling world, because Becky Lynch has become quite the, no pun intended, man of WWE. She's become a focal point of professional wrestling over these last few years. So here we are. We're going to be doing a legacy of Becky Lynch. Now, it's hard with Becky because there's a whole chunk of her career that is so chopped up, because everyone kind of knows the story of Becky Lynch. As she began training in 2002 and she trained under Fergal Devitt, Finn Balor, and has noted that she was kind of following in her brother's footsteps, and she was a very unathletic kid that just wanted to get into wrestling to do something different. She really enjoyed wrestling. She noted that Mick Foley is someone that she really, really aspired to be, and not to be, but was influenced by early on in her wrestling fandom, and she did different things in the independent circuits from 2005, but it's kind of noted that she did take a really big chunk away for 7 years, and she ended up getting some injuries very early on in her independent career, some concussions, some injuries with her eyes. It was just different things, and she decided, wrestling, this isn't working. It isn't working. We've all heard the story of why Becky kind of stepped away, but really what we're going to get into here on the legacy of is when she was signed to NXT. In April of 2013, after a 7-year hiatus from professional wrestling, now she only had about 4 appearances in the time that she was away, and they were all non-wrestling appearances. So, in this time away, she had done other things. She noted that she'd been a flight attendant, she studied the art of clown, she did many different things in her time away, but on April in 2013, she signed a 2-year developmental deal with WWE, moved to Florida, and began at NXT. On August 29th, her ring name was revealed as Becky Lynch. Who would have known that in that time that Becky Lynch would become one of, if not the biggest, female professional wrestler in the history of WWE. On June 26th, 2014, Becky Lynch would actually make her in-ring televised debut, so it wasn't nearly a whole year of being down in developmental before she actually debuted on NXT. She ended up defeating Summer Rae, and then they kind of went into this program where Becky was, we've all seen Becky's NXT debut where she was a typical Irish lass. She kind of Irish danced her way down to the ring, and no, we knew that gimmick wasn't going to be something that would last a long time, but I think we all saw something within Becky Lynch, is that she had this ultimate connection to the crowd. It was really weird seeing that and just feeling like, hey, I don't know what it is about you, but I like you. I think that's probably Becky's biggest thing that she's been with throughout this whole time with WWE, is that she's had this undenying connection to the crowd, maybe more so than the other 3 of the 4 horsewomen in Bayley, Sasha, and Charlotte, is that Becky's had this kind of underdog mentality with the fans. She's an everyday woman, and I think that's what her biggest thing is, and something that I noticed with Becky right away. While she wasn't my favorite, she had been someone that I just felt a connection to, and I think a lot of us can relate to that. Throughout her year-long time in NXT, she would compete for the NXT Women's Championship along the likes of against Charlotte, Sasha, Bayley, She would turn heel in this time as well, but it was kind of just in and out, and the four were really shaping up to what women's wrestling could be in WWE. They were the four that was kind of changing, along with others in NXT, but they were really the centerpiece of the four. I think Becky's biggest match in NXT, or a couple of biggest matches, I should say, were at the Fatal 4-Way at NXT TakeOver Rival, where she did not win the championship, but it was the four horsewomen in the match: Banks, Flair, and Bayley. Now, I think her biggest singles match, and maybe a big coming out party for Becky Lynch in this time, was at NXT TakeOver Unstoppable, where she went one-on-one with Sasha Banks. The match has always been looked at as one of the best in NXT history, as it should, and it was really like a moment where we knew Becky was going to be okay. She was going to be a star, and although she did not win the match, sometimes losing can do more than winning, and I think this is an example of that. On the July 13th episode of Raw, it's a very looked at episode of Raw because it was the debut of Charlotte, Sasha Banks, and Becky Lynch. The Divas Revolution was starting in WWE. We had the three teams: Team Bella, Team PCB, which Becky was a part of, and Team Bad. We had all these kind of things happening, and a lot of people look at this time and kind of turn their nose to it and being like, it was very convoluted, it was very weird, it didn't really lead to anything. There was nothing at stake other than just, let's have better matches and let's have more time for women, which is fine. But it was kind of this, it was a little weird, I guess you could say, but the three teams were kind of attacking one another and fighting one another. It was just kind of a different tag match every single week. However, I will say something about Becky Lynch specifically in this time. When they finally had the 3-on-3-on-3 match at SummerSlam in 2015, it was actually Becky Lynch that got the pinfall over Brie Bella to win the match for PCB. I think a lot of people kind of get lost in that because Charlotte would ultimately go on to win the Divas Championship the very next month. We had the Paige-Charlotte kind of stuff where Paige turned on PCB, specifically Charlotte, and Becky kind of got a little bit pushed to the side. And I think a lot of people noticed that. A lot of people noticed that with Sasha Banks, but a lot of people really noticed it with Becky Lynch as well. It was kind of Charlotte's Divas Championship reign, and she went on to a feud with Paige, and, you know, it was what it was. But really where we got to see Becky shine for the first time on the main roster was when Charlotte Flair turned on Becky Lynch in the beginning of 2016. They were going to have a fantastic match at the Royal Rumble event that very same year, and then they'll go into the now known as a very iconic match in WWE history, WrestleMania 32, Becky, Charlotte, Sasha, Women's Championship. The Divas Championship was no more. Charlotte Flair would ultimately win that match. Becky Lynch would tap out to the figure 8. And then things kind of went in a weird direction. We had the draft, and Becky was the first woman drafted to SmackDown. And while Charlotte and Sasha were doing incredible things over on Raw, Becky Lynch would become the very first SmackDown Women's Champion in WWE history. That's a pretty cool thing, and the crowd wanted it, Becky wanted it, we all wanted it. We all wanted it. We all knew that Becky Lynch was going to be the very first SmackDown Women's Champion, and she was spearheading the SmackDown Women's division. She was doing a lot of cool things. Becky Lynch would end up losing the SmackDown Women's Championship to Alexa Bliss later that year. Now, Becky would go through this kind of stuff throughout 2017. She'll compete at WrestleMania. She was still kind of in the conversation of the Women's Championship, but she definitely took a dip. There was different things going on. Charlotte would end up coming into SmackDown, and Charlotte would become a centerpiece in 2017, and Becky just seemed to get a little bit lost. But again, I'm going to note this again from when we're talking about her NXT time. Becky always had this connection to the crowd. And I think when we started to go into 2018, Becky Lynch was in a weird spot. She wasn't really being used on television. She was doing these kind of social media stuff with quinoa and all of this different stuff. But she was keeping herself relevant, at least to a social media audience. We all wanted Becky to kind of... For Becky to be the center point again, because I think when she's the topic of conversation, things get interesting. So Lynch would begin a winning streak over in 2018 following the 2018 Money in the Bank event. Now, she would ultimately end up earning a match with Carmella at SummerSlam. And it looked like it was going to be Becky Lynch defeating Carmella at SummerSlam. We all thought this was Becky's time to get back into the focal point, to get back into the main story, to be champion again. Charlotte Flair would ultimately end up being added to that match, and boy oh boy, I think it's an event, SummerSlam 2018, that will go down as Becky's event. Charlotte Flair would end up winning that match in a triple threat match, pinning Becky Lynch. But it was Becky Lynch who ended up being talked about a lot more than just a simple title win. Becky Lynch would turn heel for the first time on the main roster on Charlotte Flair, but ultimately would turn her into the biggest babyface in the company. It was the slap heard round the world when she attacked Charlotte Flair, and Brooklyn went nuts. And this began this began everything leading up to WrestleMania 35. This really began the rise of Becky Lynch. She would end up winning the SmackDown Women's Championship, going to Evolution in one of the best WWE women's matches in history, last woman standing against Charlotte Flair. She was ultimately set on a course with Ronda Rousey at Survivor Series in 2018. However, Nia Jax would end up punching Becky Lynch right in the nose, breaking her nose, and that iconic shot of her standing in the crowd, bloody face and all, would actually end up being a concussion, cancelling the match with Ronda. And, the rest is history with Becky Lynch, and going into the first ever women's TLC match along with Asuka and Charlotte Flair, ultimately winning the Royal Rumble match in 2019, going on to WrestleMania 35, winning the first ever women's main event in WrestleMania history, defeating Ronda Rousey and Charlotte Flair to become SmackDown and Raw Women's Champion. She was on top of the world. She really was. For the first time in company history, we had a woman who was the man, a woman who was leading the charge, a woman who was the face of the company. Becky Lynch was doing all of these things. She ended up defending her Raw and SmackDown Women's Championships in 2019 and kind of being the face of the Raw Women's division and the face of the Raw division in general, the whole Raw roster. She was the man. She was the face of the company and doing a lot of things in her year-long Raw Women's Championship reign. Now, throughout her years, she would work with the likes of Charlotte, Asuka, Lacey Evans. She was doing all different kinds of things, working with Sasha Banks in a really epic program, doing a lot of cool stuff. And she would ultimately end up working with the then newly debuting Shayna Baszler on the main roster in the WrestleMania 36 Raw Women's Championship match in front of no fans. That would ultimately end up being her last WWE Raw Women's Championship defense before she was announcing she was pregnant in May 2020. Now, here's a cool thing. Becky Lynch was at the tippy top of her run. She was at the top of her game. She was at the top of the company. And she ended up wanting to have children with husband Seth Rollins, stepping away, and we really didn't know if Becky would ever be back. There was a lot of rumblings throughout that year once she had her child that, when's Becky going to come back? Is it going to be the Royal Rumble? Is it going to be WrestleMania? It would ultimately end up being SummerSlam 2021 when Becky Lynch would return and win the SmackDown Women's Championship in controversial fashion, defeating Bianca Belair in 26 seconds. Not something that everyone thought was going to happen, but it did. And end up being, title switches and all that. But she is the current Raw Women's Champion, at least at time of recording. I don't think anything's going to change in the next few days before I release this thing, but she is the Raw Women's Champion, the current Raw Women's Champion, and looking to go into a WrestleMania program with who knows what is going on in WWE at the moment. But Becky Lynch is on top of her game, stepping away, having a child, and showing everybody that you can come back, step back into your quote-unquote spot, and being the man that you were. She's now big-time Bex, a heel character on Raw, and doing a lot of great stuff. Going into a program with Lita, pretty damn cool. Becky is fighting a childhood icon of hers, a childhood role model of hers, no doubt. It's pretty cool to say that Becky Lynch is still in this spot, and when Becky's in a moment and Becky's in a match, it really is, no pun intended, big time. That's going to do it for this week's The Legacy of. Now, we're taking a couple of weeks break here, friends, but don't worry, I'll have the date of exactly when The Legacy of is returning. It won't be too long. Just calm down, everybody. Just need a couple of weeks to decompress, get back into things. But let me know what you think about Becky Lynch in the comments section below. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications so you're getting notified of when Love Wrestling is dropping new videos. You can find all the links to my stuff and Love Wrestling stuffs in the description box below. So until, not next Monday, but a couple Mondays away, we'll be back with more The Legacy of Season number 2. Until that time, stay safe, stay beautiful, I don't know. Maybe? Yeah, cool. All right, all that good stuff. I love you all very much. My name is Josh Robinson, signing off here for Love Wrestling. Peace out, everybody.